passenger train came to rest on a section of main line where stopping was forbidden. The signals were clear. The track was straight. Nothing blocked the way forward. The engineer had made no mistake. The fireman maintained pressure. The wheels turned beneath the locomotive when throttle was applied. But the train did not move, and the longer it remained still, the less likely it became that it ever would. The afternoon run from the junction followed a route that had been in operation for 30 years. Heavy freight moved through in the early hours. Passenger service claimed the daylight. The gradient was manageable, never more than a modest climb, nothing that required special consideration from crews familiar with the district. The engineer that day had worked this line for 7 seasons. He knew where speed could be made and where caution was warranted. He understood how the locomotive responded to throttle adjustments, how much steam the fireman could sustain, and where the weight of the train would press hardest against the drawbars. The consist was typical: locomotive, tender, baggage car, 3 coaches, and a combination car at the rear. Total tonnage fell within the normal range for this power. The locomotive was not new, but had been inspected at the terminal that morning. Lubrication was adequate. Steam pressure held steady at working level throughout the first hour. They passed the lower station on time. Signals indicated clear track ahead for the next 12 miles. The route ahead included a long, gentle rise, not steep enough to be called a grade in any formal sense, but sustained. A place where momentum mattered, where losing speed meant working harder to regain it. The line climbed through a valley that narrowed gradually. Trees grew close on both sides. Rails curved slightly, following the contour of the land, then straightened as they approached the crest. Beyond that point, the grade eased and the line descended toward the next station. It was a section where trains were expected to maintain speed, where stopping was not merely discouraged, it was understood to be unwise. The operating manual did not forbid it explicitly. It simply noted that restarting on this section could present difficulties under certain conditions. Those conditions were not defined. The stop was not sudden. There was no application of emergency braking, no shouted warning, no grinding of metal. The engineer eased the throttle closed, allowed the train's own weight to slow its progress, and brought it to rest with the smooth precision of someone who had stopped 10,000 trains before. The fireman looked up from the deck, noted the absence of motion, but did not speak. There was no need. The engineer had made a decision. It would have a reason. For a moment, nothing happened. Steam vented softly from the cylinders. The fire crackled in the firebox. Somewhere in the consist behind them, a passenger shifted in a seat. But there was no alarm, no sense that anything had gone wrong. The engineer set the brake, stepped to the side of the cab, and looked back along the train. The coaches sat calmly on the rails, slightly tilted as the grade continued beneath them. No smoke, no dragging equipment, no broken coupler. Everything appeared as it should. He returned to his position and released the brake. The locomotive hissed as pressure equalized. He opened the throttle partway, feeding steam to the cylinders. The driving wheels began to turn. The side rods moved in their steady, circular rhythm. The locomotive trembled slightly as power reached the rails, but the train did not move. The wheels continued turning. The motion was smooth, controlled, without the violent slipping that would indicate a loss of adhesion. And yet the locomotive remained exactly where it had stopped. The consist behind it did not stir. The engineer closed the throttle. The wheels stopped. He stood quietly for a moment, considering what he had just witnessed, then reached for the throttle again. He applied steam more gradually this time. The throttle opened by degrees. Pressure built in the cylinders. The wheels began their rotation, slowly at first, then faster. The sound was normal, the rhythmic chuff of exhaust, the hiss of steam escaping around piston rods, the faint groan of the locomotive's frame absorbing forces it was designed to handle. But there was no corresponding lurch, no creaking of drawbars taking tension, no shift in weight as the train began to overcome inertia. The fireman moved to the rear of the cab and leaned out, watching the driving wheels. They turned steadily, without hesitation, their surfaces clean and dry against the rail. No sand had been applied. The rail itself showed no visible contamination, no oil, no moisture, no leaves pressed into a slick layer by previous traffic. The engineer allowed the wheels to turn for several seconds, then closed the throttle again. The locomotive settled. Silence returned. tried once more, this time opening the throttle further. The exhaust grew sharper. Steam pressure dropped slightly as demand increased. The wheels accelerated. And still the train did not move. The fireman returned to his side of the cab. "Feels like we're turning free," he said quietly. The engineer nodded. It did feel that way, as though the wheels were spinning without resistance, the way they might on a maintenance jack with the locomotive lifted clear of the rails. But the locomotive was not lifted. It sat firmly on the track, its full weight pressing down on the driving wheels, just as it had for every other mile they had traveled that day. He tried sanding the rails. The valve opened. Dry sand poured onto the track ahead of the drivers. The wheels turned again. The sand disappeared beneath them, crushed and scattered. But the train remained motionless. No wheel slip occurred. No violent spinning. No loss of control. The wheels simply turned in place, as though the rails offered no surface to push against. The engineer descended from the cab and walked forward along the right side of the locomotive. He crouched near the leading driver, examining the rail. The steel was clean. The head of the rail showed the faint polish of regular traffic, but no unusual wear. The gauge appeared correct. The ties beneath were solid, properly spaced, showing no sign of shifting or settlement. He walked farther ahead, studying the track for 50 feet in front of the locomotive. The alignment was straight. The grade continued upward at the same modest angle it had maintained for the past mile. There were no obstructions, no debris, no washout or subsidence. Behind him, the fireman had climbed down and was inspecting the wheels on the opposite side. He called out, "Rods look fine. Wheels are true. No cracks I can see." The engineer returned to the locomotive and walked its length, checking each driver, each side rod connection, each bearing surface. Everything appeared as it should. He moved to the tender and examined the rear trucks, then continued along the baggage car and the first coach. Passengers looked down at him through the windows, their faces more curious than concerned. One man opened a window and called out, "Trouble with the engine. Checking something." The engineer replied, his voice even. "Won't be long." But he did not know if that was true. He completed his circuit and returned to the cab. The fireman was already there, maintaining the fire, keeping steam pressure steady. The engineer stood for a moment, looking at the controls, the gauges, the familiar landscape of the cab where he had spent years of his working life. Everything indicated readiness. And yet the train would not move. He pulled the throttle open again, further this time, feeding more steam than he would normally use for a standing start. The locomotive shuddered. The exhaust roared. The wheels turned rapidly. And the train sat perfectly still. Wheel adhesion is a function of weight and friction. The locomotive's drivers pressed down on the rails with force determined by the distribution of mass. The boiler, the water in the tanks, the coal, the frame itself. That weight, multiplied by the coefficient of friction between steel wheel and steel rail, determines how much force can be transmitted before the wheels begin to slip. Under normal conditions, this is sufficient. A locomotive pulls away from rest smoothly, converting steam pressure into rotational force, and that force into forward motion. The wheels grip. The train moves. But adhesion is not constant. It changes with conditions: moisture, temperature, the condition of the rail surface, the presence of contaminants. And it changes with motion itself. Static friction, the resistance to initial movement, is higher than dynamic friction, the resistance once motion has begun. A wheel at rest grips the rail more firmly than a wheel already turning. Starting requires overcoming that initial threshold. Once motion begins, less force is needed to maintain it. This is why momentum matters, why losing speed on a grade is dangerous, why stopping is a decision that cannot always be reversed. The train had come to rest with its full weight pressing down on rails that climbed at a shallow but unrelenting angle. The locomotive's drivers carried most of the load, but the consist behind added its own demand. Coaches filled with passengers, baggage, the dead weight of frames and trucks and couplings. When the engineer had applied the train's braking system, pressure had built in the brake cylinders throughout the consist. Shoes pressed against wheels. The friction slowed the train smoothly, predictably, but it also did something else. It transferred load. As the train decelerated, weight shifted forward through the couplings. The rear of the train pressed against the front. The couplings compressed. And when the train came to rest, that pressure did not fully release. The brake shoes remained in contact with the wheels, maintaining a residual grip even after the engineer released the brake valve. The locomotive now faced a task it was not designed for, overcoming not only the static friction of its own drivers and the inertia of the consist behind it, but also the lingering resistance of brake shoes that had not fully retracted and the weight distribution that had shifted during deceleration. The wheels turned because the locomotive had power, but they could not transmit enough force to overcome the threshold of motion. The adhesion was insufficient, not because the rails were contaminated, not because the locomotive was underpowered, but because stopping itself had created conditions where restarting was no longer possible.
They waited on that grade for 40 minutes before another locomotive arrived from the junction. It coupled to the front of the train and provided the additional adhesion needed to break inertia. Together, the two locomotives pulled the train forward. Once motion was established, the assisting engine uncoupled and returned the way it had come. The original crew completed their run without further incident. No report was filed. No reprimand was issued. The engineer had violated no rule. He had simply stopped where stopping should not have occurred. In the months that followed, operating instructions for that district were revised. Crews were advised to maintain speed through the climbing section. Language was added noting that trains brought to a stand on grades exceeding a certain threshold might experience difficulty restarting due to adhesion limits and load conditions. The specific mechanics were not explained. The warning was considered sufficient. Other railroads, learning of the incident through informal channels, made similar adjustments to their own procedures. The phenomenon was not unique to one location or one line. It could occur anywhere the combination of grade, braking practice, and load distribution aligned in a particular way. What had seemed like an aberration, a single inexplicable failure, was recognized as a predictable outcome of forces that had always been present. The rails had not changed. The locomotives had not changed. Only the understanding had shifted. Momentum once lost is not easily regained. Stopping is not always reversible, and the decision to halt, even for the best of reasons, can become the mistake that cannot be undone. The train had stopped where it was not supposed to, and in doing so, it had revealed a truth about motion that crews had intuited but never fully articulated. That movement itself is a kind of safety. That stillness, in certain places, carries its own danger. The line remains in operation. Trains still climb that grade, but they do not stop.